If there's ash in your blood, the smoke isn't a distress signal. It's your signature. Rain tasted like electricity that night. Bitter, metallic, almost sentient. The border terminal was a nest of light and steel, neon veins pulsing through concrete, scanners humming like an insect hive. People moved fast, heads down, pretending the world wasn't burning from the inside out. I walked through it like a ghost with a deadline. The fake ID chip itched against my neck. My pulse matched the scanner rhythm. Beep, pause, beep. A countdown disguised as bureaucracy. The line was long enough to die in. I kept my head low. Hood dripping water. Coat heavy with borrowed scent blockers. All I needed was 20 more feet. 20 feet, and I'd be across the border. A rumor instead of a record. Then the air changed. A static crackle. A mechanical click. And the screen above the checkpoint blinked red. Flagged subject. Omega. Deserter. Threat level 3. Perfect. The guards moved fast. I moved faster. A flash of motion. My elbow slammed into the nearest throat, knee in the ribs of another, the sound of metal hitting tile. I darted sideways, slipping through the crowd. Someone screamed. Someone else shouted, "Stop him!" But the sound was already behind me. My boots hit the wet asphalt outside the terminal, and for a second, I almost believed I could outrun the whole damn city, until I saw the drones lift off the roof. Of course, they never forget their toys. I sprinted into the service corridor, the smell of ozone and oil filling my lungs. My legs burned, my shoulder screamed from an old injury, and then a voice, calm, measured, ruinously familiar, echoed through the intercom. Eli Varren, stand down. My heart forgot how to beat. I turned the corner and skidded on the slick metal floor straight into the past. He was standing there. Marrow, older, sharper, dressed in the matte black uniform of the control service. The rain hadn't dared touch him. Even the world seemed to know better. His presence carried the same gravity as 10 years ago, maybe heavier now, like time had pressed its fingerprints into him and found him unbreakable. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. Then instinct kicked in. Sarcasm, my most reliable defense mechanism. "You look older, Commander." He didn't flinch. His eyes, that steel-gray shade that made orders sound like fate, scanned me from head to toe. Then he said, evenly, "You look alive. That's the real surprise." Something twisted in my chest. Not guilt. Just irony. Behind him, guards approached, stun rifles raised. I didn't even try to run this time. One cracked me across the ribs for good measure. Professional, precise. The taste of blood hit my tongue. I spat it onto the floor and grinned up at Seb. Guess that's one way to say, "Welcome back." His jaw tightened just enough to be satisfying. Then he turned, issuing commands like the years hadn't changed anything. Secure him. Transfer to the control wing. Full containment. The guards grabbed my arms. Cuffs bit into my wrists, cold, humming faintly with energy dampers. I didn't fight. What was the point? You can't out-snarl a system designed to muzzle you. As they dragged me toward the armored transport, I glanced at Seb's back. Straight, composed, distant. The same posture he'd had when he gave the evacuation order during Howlfall. The one that left half the unit buried under their own names. And me? I'd been the one blamed for it. Rain poured harder. The neon lights flickered across the puddles like blood diluted with mercury. My reflection in the water looked like a stranger. Hollow eyes, half a smirk, bruises already forming where authority had fingers. Maybe exile really does age you. The guards shoved me into the van. The doors sealed with a hiss that sounded like surrender. I tilted my head back against the wall and let the vibrations of the engine blur the noise. For 10 years, I'd imagined what I'd say if I saw Seb Marrow again. I thought it'd be clever, or cruel, or both. Turns out, all I managed was a half-joke and a bloody grin. Figures. The city fell away behind us. towers wrapped in fog, borders shrinking to a smear of light. I caught a glimpse of Seb in the front seat, profile lit by the dashboard glow. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired, the kind of tired that sits under the skin, like ash that never washes out. "Why me, Seb?" I muttered, mostly to myself. "You've got bigger ghosts to chase." He didn't answer. Maybe he heard. Maybe he didn't. Either way, silence was his favorite weapon. The van jolted as we crossed the last checkpoint. I let my eyes close, just for a second, just long enough to remember the smell of smoke, the weight of his orders, the sound of men dying in my earpiece. The ghosts never sleep. They just wait for the lights to come back on. When the engine finally stopped, the door opened with a metallic sigh. The air that hit my face smelled like disinfectant and order. I stepped out, shackles clinking, and there he was again. Seb, perfectly still, rain dripping off the edge of his coat. "Welcome home," he said quietly. I laughed. It hurt. Home implies choice. His expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker, a tiny crack in the composure. Good. He still felt something. The guards pulled me forward, and my boots splashed through a puddle black with oil. The control facility loomed ahead, sterile lights, mirrored walls, everything designed to erase the concept of escape. "And here we are again," I whispered under my breath. Same leash, different collar. No one answered. They never do. But somewhere behind me, I heard Seb's voice, low and unmistakable. "Finally. You're where you belong." I turned just enough for him to see my smile. Sharp, humorless, defiant. "You're wrong, Commander. I'm exactly where you'll have to keep watching me, so I don't kill you with my sarcasm." He almost smiled. Almost. Then he walked away, boots echoing against the metal floor. And I thought, not for the first time, ash beneath the skin. Some burns never heal. Or maybe they just start to glow when the rain hits them. When I woke, I thought I'd died and heaven had bad taste in decor. Everything was white, too white, the kind of sterile brightness that burns your retinas and scrubs your thoughts clean. No shadows, no windows, just walls that reflected me back from every angle. Except one. The front wall wasn't a wall at all, it was glass. Reinforced, tinted, humming faintly like it was breathing on its own. Behind it, I could feel eyes. His eyes. The air smelled like antiseptic and recycled oxygen. A low hum from the ventilation system played the same note, over and over, until it started to sound like a heartbeat. Mine? His? Didn't matter. I sat up slowly, my shoulder aching where the guard's rifle had kissed me goodnight. The thin gray shirt they'd put me in clung to damp skin. Everything about this place said, "You're being studied, not stored." And I hated being predictable, even in captivity. A soft click. The intercom came to life. His voice rolled through the room, calm, deep, professional. That tone he used when pretending not to feel. "Seb, you're not in prison. You're in quarantine." I stared at the glass, at my own faint reflection overlapping his outline behind it. "Eli, quarantine implies danger. I'm mostly just inconvenient." There was a small pause, not long enough to be hesitation, but long enough for me to notice. "Seb, some would argue, those are the same thing." "Eli, then I'm flattered. I've always wanted to be contagious." For a second, I could have sworn I saw him glance down, maybe to hide the almost smile that threatened his face. Then it was gone, buried under that perfect composure again. Hours passed, or minutes. In this place, time was just another control mechanism. They fed me through a slot in the wall, nutrient paste disguised as soup. I tasted metal and boredom. I stood, paced the room, tested the edges of my cage. Every surface was smooth, seamless, like the inside of a thought someone didn't want me to finish. When I leaned close to the glass, my reflection stared back. Tired eyes. bruised mouth, a man who looked like a bad idea that refused to die. And behind that reflection, in the faintest blur, was Seb. He was out of uniform this time. No insignia of rank, no crest of the pack. Just a slim black shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a metallic tag at his collarbone, a private service mark. Not a commander anymore, just another contractor selling control. Something bitter curled in my chest. Eli, nice tag, Commander. You working freelance now? Seb, private enforcement. It's efficient. Eli, efficient is what people say when they've stopped believing in right and wrong. Seb, still allergic to authority, I see. Eli, still pretending you are it. The silence after that was almost comfortable, like an old bruise you. I've stopped poking, but it still throbs just to remind you it's there. He left for a while, long enough for me to start counting the tiles on the ceiling, 57.5, depending on your optimism. When the door finally opened, it was so quiet I almost missed it. He stepped inside, clipboard, gloves, controlled posture. The air around him carried that faint metallic scent of rain and circuitry. I didn't move. I wanted to see what he'd do first. He placed a thin file on the table between us. My name printed neatly on the front. Eli Varren, disciplinary review. Inside, photographs, transcripts, signatures, the official story of how I'd betrayed my pack. Every word a lie. Every word stamped and approved by someone who'd never seen blood on their own hands. Seb, you should read it. Eli, I wrote half of it. He looked at me then, not with anger, but with that slow, dissecting focus that used to strip recruits down to their bones. Seb, you had potential. You could have done more good inside the system. Eli, yeah, well, the system had a habit of killing its own. Hard to send thank you cards post-mortem. He exhaled softly. The ghost of frustration, maybe regret. Seb, you could have run further. Eli, I did. You were just faster. He leaned against the table, the glass between us catching his reflection, doubling him, the man he was and the one he pretended to be. Seb, what were you doing at the border? Eli, trying to find a place that doesn't have your face on every screen. That earned me a flicker of something behind his eyes. Amusement, maybe. It looked almost human. The file sat between us like a third person in the room. Silent, accusing, familiar. He opened it, flipped through a few pages, then slid one toward me, a photo of me from 10 years ago. Younger, sharper, wearing his insignia. My throat went dry. I covered it with a laugh. Eli, nice nostalgia trip. You keeping those for bedtime stories? Seb, I keep them for context. Eli, context. That what they call guilt now? Gaze didn't waver. Mine didn't either. There it was again. That tension, the invisible line between interrogation and intimacy. Between two people who had once trusted each other enough to die in the same foxhole. And now? We were dissecting ghosts. I stood up, restless energy clawing at my ribs. The glass caught my movement, amplifying it. Two of me pacing, one in the reflection, one in the cage. He watched, always watching. I grabbed the cup from the tray. Empty, plastic, harmless. I turned it in my hand, weighing the idea before it even formed. Then I threw it. It hit the glass with a hollow thunk, bounced off, and rolled back toward me like the universe mocking my aim. Eli, you want a confession? Fine. I stared right at him. Eli, I confess, you're still a hypocrite. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Not quite anger. Something in between. Something I remembered. Seb, that's not the confession I was hoping for. Eli, yeah, well. Lower your expectations. It's safer that way. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air between the glass felt thicker than the air I was allowed to breathe. He finally turned, collecting the file with that same maddening calm. The door slid open. He stepped out without a word. The sound of it closing behind him was almost silent, quieter than a gunshot. But the noise in my head stayed loud. He left quieter than a bullet, but the echo stayed, right under my skin. Control smells like disinfectant and old authority. It hums in the walls, in the vents, in the pulse of the floor panels. Even the lights seem disciplined, flicking on and off in perfect rhythm, like soldiers marching in fluorescent armor. Seb calls it a behavioral assessment. I call it a new hobby for bored alphas with god complexes. The tests start simple. Stand, respond, obey. A camera follows every movement, blinking red like an unblinking eye. There's a voice through the intercom. His voice, measured, exact, the same cadence he used years ago when we trained under rain and gunfire. Seb, state your designation. Eli, uncooperative civilian. Temporary exhibit. Static. Then a pause, as if he's trying not to sigh. Seb, you're testing boundaries. Eli, that's what you hired me for, isn't it? He doesn't answer. He never does when I win the round. After the third test, I get bored. They left me a datapad, restricted access, but I was internal security once. The kind of agent who could open digital locks with a smile and a headache. It takes me 8 minutes to bypass the firewall, 2 to reprogram my ID chip, and another 5 to shut off the cameras. When the red light dies, I swear the room exhales with me. I stretch, roll my shoulders, and scrawl a note on the metal table using the stylus they shouldn't have given me. You still overthink everything. Then, I set the note right under the nearest lens, knowing he'll see it the second he turns the feedback on. I spend the rest of the day humming old military signals to the rhythm of the ventilation hum. A petty symphony for the man who used to conduct me. The door slides open at midnight. He walks in, no gloves this time, no clipboard, just the weight of quiet authority. His presence pulls the oxygen out of the air, like gravity with an ego. He's holding my note. Seb, you tampered with the system. Eli, define tampered. Seb, you disabled surveillance. Eli, temporarily. You're welcome. Privacy's healthy. He steps closer, the metallic floor vibrating under his boots. I can feel the static between us, the kind that used to fill the barracks before an explosion or a kiss. Seb, do you think this is a game? Eli, if it is, you're losing, again. His jaw tightens. He looks like he's debating between throttling me and writing a report about it. I hope he chooses the first. It's more interesting. Seb, you're under observation for a reason. Eli, yeah, I'm sure the report says, highly irritating, refuses to die politely. He exhales, sharp. Then, the move I don't expect. He grabs my wrist, pushes me back until my shoulders hit the wall. The metal is cold. His grip isn't. We're close enough to share breath now. Close enough for my heartbeat to forget its training. Eli, smirking, so this is it? You'll discipline me personally? Seb, if that's what it takes. His voice drops, low and quiet, the kind that could make orders sound like promises. For a second, the world tilts. The room shrinks to 2 people and too much air between them. I tilt my head, studying him, the fine tension at his jaw, the muscle twitch in his temple, the scent of metal and restraint. Eli, you don't want obedience. Eli, you want the illusion of control. The words land like a strike. He freezes, just long enough to confirm I hit the target. Then, he lets go. His hands fall away, slow, deliberate. He takes a step back, recalibrating his composure like a machine rebooting. Seb, you haven't changed. Eli, you have. You stopped pretending you had a soul. That earns me silence. The best kind of victory. He straightens his cuffs. An unnecessary gesture, but it buys him a few seconds. His breathing steadies, his eyes refocus, his mask slides back into place. Seb, you'll stay here until further notice. Eli, translation. Until I behave. Seb, until you remember how. Eli, good luck with that. He turns to leave, but hesitates at the door. Just a flicker of indecision. The ghost of something he refuses to name. When the door seals behind him, the silence rushes back in like floodwater. I stand there a moment, tracing the faint heat his hands left on my skin. Not because I want to remember it, but because I hate that I can. The hum of the ventilation fills the void again. Lights dim to their night cycle. Shadows stretch across the floor, long and thin like leashes. I drop back onto the metal cot, staring at the ceiling's silver seams. He's still a commander, and I still don't know how to obey. The thought should feel like defiance. Instead, it feels like gravity. Night turned the control wing into a cathedral of screens. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving only the low thrum of server racks and the thermostat's dry breath. I'd learned the building's circadian rhythm by then. Which doors sighed open after midnight, which cameras blinked slower when the network refreshed. The nurse who brought my evening meds forgot to lock the panel under the meal slot. Or maybe someone forgot on purpose. Either way, the maintenance hatch exposed a fiber line and a diagnostic port so shiny it felt like an invitation. I lay flat on the floor, cheek cooling against steel, and coaxed the port awake with the contraband stylus I'd never returned. The security shell greeted me like an old colleague who still owed me money. 8 minutes, not because I'm slow, but because pride likes round numbers. The camera in my room, which I'd trained to loop, kept playing the world's most boring version of me, sleeping. The terminal outside my glass lit up, only for me, a reflected galaxy on the surface. A ghost cursor blinked. I skimmed an index labeled in corporate monotone, incident archive, internal access only, old missions, debriefs, names I hadn't let myself think about in years. I should have looked away. I didn't. The first files were clean history, logistics, after-action notes, redactions like black scars. Then a folder lowered its eyes and refused to be obvious. HF-13. Aux. Crypt. HF. My throat went dry. I opened it. Encrypted blocks poured down the screen, checksum strings, timestamps, node routes. Whoever hid this wanted it to look like junk. Junk doesn't hide this well. I spun the stylus, unlocked an old habit, and built a skeleton key from 3 broken protocols. The blocks shivered, then resolved into fragments, audio slivers, heat maps, telemetry, all stamped with the name they'd hammered into my bones. Howlfall. The room shrank around me. Under the glass, I could see my face briefly reflected over the maps. Older than I remembered, eyes lit by the kind of blue that forgives nothing. A soft motion outside my cell drew a ripple in the screens. I knew he was there before the glass recognized him. Seb didn't speak. He just stood in the threshold of the dark office, illuminated by the way the monitors loved him. It was the first time I'd seen him down here at night. No entourage, no report. To lean on, just the man and the machine, both carved to look inevitable. I waited for the alarm. The scolding. The shutdown. None came. Instead, Seb stepped inside, past the motion sensor and the office lights, rose to a dusk-level glow, turning us into 2 shadows with beating hearts. "Don't stop," he said quietly. The cursor blinked like a pulse under my hand. I scrolled. Telemetry cut into life. A ridgeline topography, wind direction, thermal signatures moving like a flock of embers. Radio transcripts fuzzed into coherence. Unit Bravo, adjust bearing. Smoke density rising. Negative, we still have friendlies in the outer ring. Command says fall back, repeat, fall back. Sir, that's... You heard him? Underneath the data, the timeline didn't line up with the official report I'd been buried under a decade ago. Markers shifted. Orders came earlier. The evacuation directive, Seb's directive, arrived before the last beacon blinked out. You think I didn't question it? Seb's voice came from somewhere left of my shoulder, not like a challenge, but like a confession that had rubbed his ribs raw for years. I kept my eyes on the screen. You didn't die for it either. Silence. The kind with weight. The past lunged at the glass, and we both stared at it like it might break through. He moved closer, not touching the desk, not touching me, just standing in the blast radius of what we were unlocking. Play the audio at 2:13:8, he said. I did. Sound of wind in a burned forest. Static flaring like sparks. A voice I recognize the way you recognize your own nightmares. Marrow to Bravo, disengage. That's an order. A heartbeat. We still have live signals in the trench. Sir, disengage, Lieutenant. That's final. The memory of that night rose like heat off asphalt. But this time, the file cut differently. Another feed spliced in. Command chatter I'd never heard. Confirm. Secondary ignition in Sector 9. Authorize purge to prevent spread. Collateral? Acceptable ranges. My fingers tightened around the stylus. Someone had filed death under acceptable. I risked a glance at Seb. The blue light painted him in hard strokes, cheekbone, brow, the small groove by his mouth that only appeared when he bit something back. His hands were open at his sides, like he had to remind them not to make fists. What did they tell you? I asked. That I was saving whoever was left, he said, and that the fire would take everyone else anyway. I scrubbed forward. Heat maps went jagged. The ridge became a mouth swallowing red. The last beacon blinked twice, alive, alive, then disappeared. Not because of fire, because the beacon was turned off. Someone killed the signal, I said. Then, they wrote the story to blame the weather. Seb closed his eyes, long and deliberate. When he opened them, there was something unfamiliar in his gaze. Not the hardness I knew. An admission that hardness hadn't worked. For the first time since my capture, my sarcasm didn't rise to meet us. Why didn't you stop me? I asked. The question surprised me. It belonged to a younger version of me who still believed stopping was an option. 10 years ago. Why didn't you stop Howlfall? He didn't look away. I tried, he said. Not hard enough, not early enough. They told me we were evacuating non-combatants at dawn. I believed them. His jaw flexed. I gave the order to fall back, because the command line said the ridge was compromised. I didn't know they compromised it. He reached past me and, without touching my hand, adjusted the scrub bar. Another audio block bloomed, one that didn't exist in any official database. The voice of command again, lighter this time, like the speaker was sipping coffee between sentences. Confirm project yields from Omega tag activation. Note: perimeter compliance improved by 37% in blackout conditions. Proceed with asset retirement. Mark as wildfire casualty. The word asset scraped my skin. I translated it the way we both had to. Omega. I swallowed, and suddenly the sterile office smelled like that night. Resin, heated metal, fear. The screens flickered, shimmering our reflections so that I couldn't tell where I ended and he began. Everything in my report was wrong, I said. Everything in mine was incomplete, he answered. We listened to a final audio, a medic cursing, a name shouted, a signal gone. Then silence. The kind that makes your guts understand gravity. He braced his hands on the edge of the console and leaned forward until his reflection collided with mine. From this close, the blue wash exposed what uniform lighting had hidden, the bruise yellow, tiredness under his eyes, the hairline silver at his temple, the way his knuckles whitened. Eli, he said, it wasn't an order. It wasn't regret. It was a name given back. I breathed out, shaky in a way I hated. I let my palm flatten against the glass separating my half-room from the office. He didn't mirror the gesture. He didn't need to. The monitors did it for him. Two men layered across data that loved neither of them. You weren't the enemy, he said, voice low. And I wasn't the hero, I said. He gave a short, humorless exhale that might have been a laugh if this were a different story. I don't know if I ever was either. We stood in that suspended dark for a while, the machines murmuring like a distant tide, a flaw in the glass, just a small ripple. Bent his reflection at the shoulder, like the light had to account for the places he'd broken. When they branded me a traitor, I said, "It wasn't because I lied." "I know," he answered. The cursor blinked. The screen timed out, then flared again as if refusing to forget. I closed the file and locked the path, memorizing it by muscle and spite. He didn't try to erase it. He didn't call security. He just watched me as if learning a new language made of silence. Between us, the hum of the servers, the prickle of unslept nights, the taste of a truth too late to save the dead, but not too late to damn the living who wrote it. I stepped back. He did too. The distance settled like dust. When he finally spoke, it was barely above the sound of the fans. "We were both betrayed," he said. "Just differently." The monitors dimmed to black, and I saw us reflected there. Two shadows stitched together by a line. Neither of us had drawn, standing at the edge of a story that was starting to rewrite itself. The building slept like a trained animal. Light sensors dimmed to a domestic purr. Elevators on a leash. Cameras swiveling along lazy, pre-programmed arcs. Somewhere above, the city breathed in glass and rain. Down here, the air was all wires and old decisions. He came for me after midnight. No uniform, no insignia, just a dark jacket, sleeves shoved to his forearms, and a keyring that looked like it could unlock bad habits. When the door to my glass box sighed, he stepped in with the kind of quiet that announces itself anyway. I sat up on the cot. "That jacket doesn't say Commander. It says, 'I'm not here,'" Seb answered. A second later, "And neither are you." The cuffs on the wall blinked green to yellow to off. The glass panel rasped open, and the cold air of the corridor touched my skin like a warning. He didn't offer his hand. Seb never implied more than he could back up. He just tipped his chin toward the hall. We walked side by side, our reflections traveling the opposite direction in the polished metal. The floor vibrated with the steady hum of infrastructure, a mechanical heartbeat that had long ago learned to ignore guilt. "Top brass covered it," he said, low, while we passed a sleeping security kiosk. "The experiments, Omega tag activation, behavior shaping. They called it a compliance protocol." My laugh came out wrong. Pretty words for a choke chain. His jaw tightened. "They buried the evidence under wildfire reports and budget memos. We reached a service stairwell." He keyed it open with a chipped card and a thumbprint that had probably signed more orders than apologies. The stairwell exhaled the smell of concrete and dust. I stopped at the landing, angled my body so the light caught his face. "You're helping me escape?" His eyes didn't flicker. He'd always been the kind of man who didn't blink near fire. "I'm helping us finish what they started, they being the ones who called you a traitor," he said, "and called me a hero. For the same night. There's a kind of freedom that happens when the person who owns your worst memory finally says it out loud. It isn't forgiveness. It's oxygen." We went down. 2 flights, then 3, the temperature dropping with each turn, the air thickening into basement humidity and old ventilation. A heavy door waited at the bottom, painted the color bureaucrats think looks harmless. Seb worked 2 keys and a code. The lock yawned like a secret that had been waiting too long. The subterranean archive had a smell I remembered from barrack storerooms and bad dreams, dust warmed by servers. Stale coffee ground into carpet, something faintly chemical, like burned plastic smoothed with apologies. Rows of black racks marched into the dark, LEDs winking in patient Morse. Cabinets with paper spines stood sentry along the far wall, old records that hadn't yet learned how to lie digitally. "If I die," I said, conversational, as he handed me a low-beam headlamp. "Make sure they spell my name right this time." "If you die," he said, deadpan, "I'll kill you." Romantic, practical, we moved. I took the terminals. Seb took the physical keys. He navigated the drawers with muscle memory, the same unshowy competence he'd used to strip and reassemble a rifle, to field dress a wound, to break a heart without raising his voice. I jacked into a live node and fed it a flavor of my old clearance it hadn't seen in a decade. The system flinched, then held still. I coaxed it with familiar lies. Files unspooled, Omega tag arch, pilot, behavioral modulation. The blandest titles often hold the sharpest teeth. Find the auxiliary conduits, Seb said. Voice not quite a command. Howlfall's blackout sequence piggybacked on something. Wasn't just power loss. I drilled through submenus until the good stuff bled through. Tag architecture, calibration logs, compliance coefficients. Behind the numbers, a cruelty brushed its hair and smiled for the mirror. Here, I pulled up a telemetry grid. They built a backdoor into the tags, remote stims, overrides. See these spikes? That's not panic, that's injected. He left the files and came around to stand by my shoulder, not touching, close enough that his heat felt like an argument the room couldn't host. The graphs made blue scars across our faces. Pain? He asked. Not always. They learned euphemisms. Directional discomfort. Negative reinforcement vectors. But this, I highlighted a sharp wave that hit at consistent intervals. This is a leash. And this, a flat line after a final spike, is a kill switch. The word landed like a glass dropped in a quiet room. We both watched it break. Seb's hands braced on the desk, knuckles pale. They told me the tags were passive, he said. Identification only. They told you a lot of things. I zoomed in on a batch ID. Look. Deployment dates. Howlfall had a tag refresh 2 days before the operation. Pushed by command, signed off by the name rendered. He didn't react, but the lights seemed to tilt around him. Your direct superior, I said. My handler, he corrected softly. There's a difference, apparently. I flipped to audio logs, the ones the public narrative never needs. Compliance improved by 37% under blackout conditions, correlate with non-compliant assets? Retire, mark casualty, weather-related. We listened, not breathing. When the clip ended, the archive's hum returned, louder than before. The shelves leaned in. Somewhere deep in the room, a fan hiccuped and recovered. Say it, I told him. He didn't ask what. The tags were used to herd Omegas off the ridge, he said. The words were clean and surgical and awful. Not by the fire, by the switch. Howlfall didn't fail. It did what someone wanted. And they blamed the dead for not running fast enough. My voice was steady, but the blood in my ears wrote a different story. They blamed me for calling it out. He turned, just enough for the headlamp to sketch halo light along his jaw. And I blamed myself for obeying. We let that sit. The servers ticked in the quiet like old clocks remembering names. Copy everything, he said. I'm not an intern, I said, fingers already moving. I'm stealing it. The download crawled. Of course it did. Systems like this move slow when it matters. Seb prowled the aisles, checking blind corners out of habit, the way predators check fences. I rifled the paper files while the data pulled its stubborn feet. Handwritten notes, crossed out lines, Polaroids of tag prototypes taped in with bureaucratic pride. One folder hid what the screens didn't, a photo of an Omega with the tag nested along the line. Of his collarbone, a bruised purple ring under the skin where an electrode sat too long. The caption didn't say his name. It said, Asset 22 billions. His eyes looked like mine used to when I still believed orders were a kind of love. Evidence of fatalities tied directly to activation spikes, I said, nursing the fury so it didn't spill. Not exposure, not smoke. Electrical cascade, neural collapse. They did this, and then they put me in a clean room and told me the weather killed them, Seb answered. His voice should have broken on the last word. It didn't. He'd always been careful where he put his fractures. The progress bar crawled past 80%. Somewhere above us, the building shivered. Plumbing, or a night janitor, or the past realizing it had been cornered. Contingency? I asked. We get this to a node outside the network, he said, then to a journalist who doesn't scare easy. And a judge who hates being lied to, I snorted. So, a unicorn. If necessary, he came back to the workstation, close enough that our shoulders nearly brushed. Eli. There it was again, my name as an offering, not a leash. Don't try to be noble if this goes loud, he said. We don't bleed for optics. Who said anything about bleeding? I smiled without showing teeth. I prefer biting. 96%, I added to the room, because the room needed a number that wasn't a body count. We stood like that for a beat. Two silhouettes in a cave of patient machines, the smell of dust and warm plastic turning the air into something we could chew. I felt the temptation to reach for him and strangle it before it learned my name. The bar hit 100. The drive in my palm glowed with its small, indecent truth. Alarms didn't blare. The trap here was more elegant. The corridor lights shifted from night blue to the color of teeth. The cooling fans throttled down, which meant heat elsewhere was powering up. Guests, I said. Or hosts, he said. He closed the drawers without leaving fingerprints. I killed the session without leaving a shadow. We moved to the door with the kind of quiet that makes a good story in the retelling and a bad epitaph in the moment. At the threshold, I glanced back at the racks, rows of sleeping monsters blinking their little eyes. You know, I said, for a compliance protocol, it's not very obedient. It obeyed exactly the right people, Seb said. We slipped into the stairwell and started up, soft-footed, breath-controlled, bodies, in an old choreography that remembered how to stay alive without being asked. At the landing, I tucked the drive under my tongue for a second while. He listened at the seam of the door. A stupid habit, a lucky one. The metal tasted like pennies and proof. He nodded once. Clear. We climbed. Somewhere between one flight and the next, the past and present traded places, and I felt lighter in a way that had nothing to do with gravity. The kind of lightness you get when the ground beneath you admits it was a trap and you learn to walk anyway. At the top of the stair, he keyed us through and paused with his hand still on the reader. He didn't look at me when he spoke. They turned omegas into circuitry, he said. Predators who write rules always do. And we rewired theirs, I said. He glanced over. The old command in his gaze softened into something almost reckless. Try to keep up. I've been ahead of you all night, I said. This time, he almost smiled. We stepped into the corridor, carrying a dead operations heartbeat in my pocket, and the first, clean rule we'd had in years between us. If the system calls you an asset, steal the system. The first alarm didn't scream. It purred. A soft shift in the hallway's light, blue to surgical white, followed by the barely there hiccup of the cooling fans. Seb's gaze snapped to the ceiling. Mine dropped to the drive, burning a small square of heat through my pocket. Signals intercepted, he said, already moving. Tell me something optimistic, I muttered. We're not the only ones awake. That counted. We were halfway up the service stairs when the building finally found its voice. Sirens snapped to life, every door stuttered, and the vents coughed out air that tasted like recycled panic. A security drone angled past the landing glass and slowed, as if deciding whether we qualified as a meeting or a problem. Problem, I advised it, and yanked Seb by the sleeve. The door to sublevel C fought the key, then surrendered with a pain-etched groan. We spilled into a corridor no one bothered to decorate. Just pipe veins, conduit ribs, paint the color of unasked forgiveness. Footsteps answered 2 corners over. Multiple, synchronized, the cadence of people who never leave a room without writing it down first. Where? I asked. Lab wing, he said. The incineration manifold's there. If they want to sterilize evidence, they'll light their lies on fire, I finished. Poetic. Efficient, he corrected. And then we were running. Security door. Badge reader. Fist. The reader lost. We hit the lab wing as the auto-fire suppressors sneezed and failed. Heat rolled at us, dry, angry, alive. Through the observation glass, rows of lab benches became silhouettes, then charcoal sketches, then nothing but bright geometry behind smoke. An overhead light burst with a sound like brittle laughter. You planned for this? I asked over the sirens. I plan for what bad men do to stay good, he said. It's made me worse at parties. A squad rounded the far corner, matte helmets, rifles steady, eyes the cool indifference of salaried violence. The lead guard saw Seb and hesitated just enough for fear to repaint his training. He still lifted his gun. Seb's hand hit my chest, pressed me back into the shadow of a support pillar. Stay behind me. Since when do I know, he said, and opened fire. Controlled, precise, not a single bullet wasted. Bodies dropped into smoke like stones into a river, the ripples invisible but real enough to enter the story. I slid low, using the chaos like a tide. When a second squad breached from the side hall, I grabbed the nearest rolling cart and shoved it into their shins. Metal shrieked. Rifles stuttered. One guard collapsed, his helmet skidding along the floor and clipping my ankle like a sullen apology. Seb was everywhere he needed to be, and nowhere he didn't. Moving like memory had given him the route and shame had made him practice it. A round sang past my ear and stitched heat into the wall. I smelled hot plaster. I smelled my own blood, tin sweet and embarrassing. Left, he barked. I went left. The lab doors ahead had auto-locked themselves with the self-preservation instincts of a coward. The small glass viewports showed a room already turning into a map of after. Flames licked at the cabinets with slow, hungry patience. In the center, a bank of servers refused to die easy, their LEDs blinking with insect insistence. That's our node, I said. That's their accelerant, Seb answered, and shoved a pry bar under the door's seam. The building roared, something structural giving up with a sound I felt in my teeth. From the vents, smoke rolled thick and oily. A soft boom rippled under our feet, a pulse that radiated outward, like a dropped bowl shattering and trying to remember being whole. I jammed my salt-bitten stylus into the lock interface and told it a bedtime story about compliance. The door chattered, offended, then opened a hand's width. Breathe shallow, Seb said. If I stop breathing altogether, send flowers, I said, and slipped through. Heat hit like a statement the room wanted to argue. The servers whined, brave little liars, their casings deforming gracefully under the romance of catastrophe. I went straight for the nearest rack and popped a panel. The drive I needed winked at me like we shared a joke about poor life choices. Behind me, the window glass spidered. A guard used the moment to put 3 tidy holes right where my skull had recently been. Seb stepped into the line of fire and discouraged him from further participation. 2 minutes, I called. You have 30 seconds. You sound like a dentist, I said, yanking cables free. The last connector clung like denial. I tore it loose and shoved the drive into my pocket with its brother. Dare. Twins. On me, Seb said. And I didn't argue because some instincts don't age. We backed toward the door as a ceiling panel buckled and fell, white-hot metal kissing the floor with a hiss. Fire leapt, eager, fast, a child who had waited too long to be introduced to oxygen. My eyes watered. My throat wrote a will. At the threshold, the door decided it had done enough and tried to be history. Seb braced his shoulder against it and made the opposite case. Something in the frame groaned and then accepted negotiations. We spilled back into the corridor, where the air tasted almost like a thing we could drink. That's when the real company arrived. Not the guards. The service. Suits cut from budgets and promises. pistols that spent more time in boardrooms than ranges. Behind them, a pair of drones hovered, their quiet rotors the exact pitch of bad news. "Stand down," one suit called. His voice was polished, like he'd sanded off the human parts. He glanced at Seb and smiled the polished smile of a man who thinks he owns the definition of the word colleague. "Commander Marrow. Always where the fire is, "Not a commander," Seb said. "Semantics," the suit replied. Then his gaze slid to me and the asset. "How convenient you've reunited." "Asset this," I said, and showed him 2 fingers I'm sure his etiquette coach disapproved of. The drones tilted forward. Seb didn't wait. He shot the closer drone out of the air and shoulder-slammed me into a maintenance alcove as the second spat zip rounds that hammered sparks out of the wall. The suit swore with polished diction. We went low. He went loud. I rolled, came up under Seb's arm, and flung the emergency foam lever with the theatricality it deserved. A gout of suppressant screamed across the hall, coating suits, drones, and a commemorative plaque in white. The drone's rotors squealed, choked, and spun down. A suit cried out in a tone that suggested stain anxiety. "Go," Seb said, catching my elbow. We ran. Corridors blurred, hazard tape, evacuation arrows, a motivational poster promising integrity. The ceiling in one hall had caved, rebar dangling like a bad idea at a party. We ducked and tripped and didn't fall. A sprinkler system finally remembered its calling and came to life, adding steam to the smoke and a patter that sounded almost like rain if you were generous and stupid. "Stairwell," Seb said. We hit it, taking steps 3 at a time. My side burned where something had kissed me earlier in the evening. The kiss had teeth. I pressed a palm there and glanced down. Blood slicked my fingers, polite and persuasive. "If you wanted a dramatic rescue, you could have just asked nicely," I said through a breath that wasn't behaving. "This is me asking nicely," Seb said without looking back. We broke into a mezzanine that overlooked the atrium. Below, a fire rolled across the lobby's designer rug with decadent grace. Above, the skylight had become a black-lipped eye. Smoke drew its eyeliner thick. A security shutter tried to drop in front of us. Seb caught it on the downswing and held, tendons standing out in his forearms like truth. "Under," he gritted. I slid. The metal kissed my back and complained. He followed, clearing by a breath and a promise. The shutter slammed behind us, furious at the narrative. On the far side, the emergency exit framed the night like a dare. Outside, wind worried at the smoke, tugging it down the boulevard. Sirens answered other sirens in civic harmony. The city was awake now, and a dozen glass towers watched us with voyeuristic interest. We were 3 strides from the door when a bullet bit the wall near my head and chewed a little stone into my cheek. I spun, dizzy with oxygen debt and anger. The suit from the lab wing had found another gun and the part of his courage he kept in his pocket. He raised the barrel toward my chest. Seb stepped between us. The shot went wide, not by luck, by Seb's hand on the man's wrist, twisting bone into the shape of compliance. The gun clattered. The suit made a noise usually edited out of success stories. Seb didn't look at him again. He looked at me. "I believe the wrong people," he said. Smoke smeared the edges of the world. The heat painted him in furnace colors, copper skin, ember eyes, the pale seam of an old scar by his collarbone catching firelight like memory. "So did I said. "Once. We moved together not because one of us ordered it, but because gravity had finally learned our names." He hooked an arm around my waist, unquestioned, unasked, and we crossed the threshold into air that tasted like rain and distant sirens and the kind of freedom you don't advertise because someone will tax it. Behind us, the building exhaled a long, exhausted breath and sagged inward. Glass came down in ribbons. Flames flexed their vertebrae and climbed higher, licking at the night like a language only bad decisions speak. The control service tower burned as if trying to cleanse itself by example. We didn't look back until we were across the street, under the questionable shelter of a transit awning. Seb pressed me against the cold pillar to check my side. Fingers clinical, careful. His face was soot-streaked, eyes bright and cold and impossibly alive. "I'm fine," I lied. "Lie later?" He tore open a med pack with his teeth, taped gauze with the certainty of a man who's done this too often. When he was done, his palm stayed a heartbeat longer than necessary, warm through the gauze. We both felt it and pretended we hadn't. The tower groaned, a cathedral at the end of its hymn. A final plume of fire reached for the sky and found the limit of its arms. Ash drifted down like slow, gray snow. I lifted my hand and let a fleck melt across my skin. It left a smudge that wouldn't rub out, a mark not made by rank or metal or law, a simple record of what had burned and what hadn't. "Ash beneath the skin," I said, not sure if I'd meant to say it out loud. "You can wash the surface. It still stays." "Good," Seb said, voice low. "Then we don't forget who lit it." He took one last look at the blaze, turned his back on it, and offered me what passed for a shoulder in his language. I took it, not as a leash, as balance. We walked into the night, sirens calling other men to other fires, the drive's small weight in my pocket tugging the future into shape. Behind us, the building kept burning, bright enough to throw our shadows long ahead, like we were already farther than we were. Maybe that's what hope is, a shadow that outruns you until you decide to match its stride. "Next time," I said, because quiet made me honest and honesty made me nervous. We planned the dramatic rescue before the explosives. "Next time," he said, "we light the fuse ourselves." He glanced over, and the fire colored his mouth almost into a smile. We kept going. The ash fell soft, and under my skin, something that had been smothered for years flickered and took, small, stubborn, flame. The clinic wasn't really a clinic. It was a repurposed storage loft over a mechanic's shop, the kind of place where the walls remembered oil and the windows remembered weather. Somebody had scrubbed the floor until it surrendered its stains, arranged a handful of cots, and declared it a recovery ward. The IV poles were scavenged from a hospital auction. The privacy curtains were old blackout drapes, with the edges hemmed by optimism. I'd been there long enough to memorize the ceiling, 3 hairline cracks, radiating from the sprinkler head like a star map no one had named. My bandages itched with religious fervor. The pain meds worked just well enough to make boredom louder. On a scale of 1 to 10, I told the ceiling, "Today's tedium is a generous 11. The ceiling did not applaud. Footsteps on the metal stairs, the good kind, balanced, patient, not trying too hard to be quiet. I pushed up on my elbows before he appeared, which I pretended didn't cost me anything. Seb ducked under the door frame with 2 coffees and a folder under his arm. No uniform, no insignia, just the habitual order that clung to him like a second skin. He set 1 cup in my hand, the heat immediate and almost indecent, and put the folder on the rolling tray the clinic insisted on calling a table. "You look terrible," he said, which in his mouth sounded dangerously like affection. "I feel fantastic," I said. "If fantastic means held together by gauze and stubbornness." "I checked the dictionary," he said, pulling a straight-back chair close with a scrape. "That's the 3rd definition." The coffee was strong enough to make promises. The first sip went down like forgiveness. I didn't realize how much I'd missed the taste of anything that wasn't antiseptic until the aftertaste turned sweet. "What's in the folder?" I asked. "Work." "You brought me homework," I said. "On a sick bed, you're not sick," he said, and the softer thing inside the sentence landed where it always did. Under the ribs. "You're recovering." He flipped the folder open. Inside, printouts, contact names, 2 burner phones with the stickers still on the screens, a logo I didn't recognize yet, plain letters, a thin underline, The design language of people who want to be believed. Private group, he said. Small. Anonymous. We take what we have and aim it where it hurts. Leaks to the right places. Testimony to the right judges. We don't try to rebuild the whole system. We break the parts that made Howlfall possible. I let my finger drift over the top page. An org chart stripped of titles. A web of connections drawn in pencil and patience. And if the system doesn't appreciate constructive criticism, we're very persistent critics. I looked at him. He held the look like he always had, steady, without theatrics. The burn at his temple had mostly faded. The bruise along his jaw had gone the yellow of late forgiveness. So, what's my rank now? I asked, because humor has a way of finding the soft places and convincing them not to bolt. Pain in the ass, he said without missing a beat. Senior level. I laughed, then winced, then refused to admit I'd winced and laughed again. He waited out the wince, like a man who's learned the shape of it. When the pain ebbed, I set the coffee down and let my head rest against the cool of the wall. You know we'll burn everything down again, right? I said, not by accident, on purpose. If that's what it takes. He nodded once, the kind of nod that closes a pact. Then we build something better from the ashes. The line should have sounded like a poster. It didn't. It sounded like an intention with dirty hands. He spent the next hour catching me up, who had reached out after the tower burned, who had panicked, who had doubled down. Names I knew. A few I didn't. The drive contents had already moved twice. Once to a journalist with an iron stomach, once to a prosecutor who owed a debt to a dead medic. The suits who'd called me an asset were issuing statements about isolated irregularities and unforeseen malfunctions. The city, which adored a spectacle, had tried to decide whether we were villains or whether. It would keep trying. It was good at that. You sure you want me on a team? I asked, after the briefings turned into the soft quiet of shared air. I don't do uniforms. I don't do speeches. I do biting comments and poorly timed honesty. You do inconvenient truth, he said. We need that. I also do boredom badly. Then get dressed, he said, standing. I'm rescuing you from it. I eyed the bandages. Where are we going? If you say another basement, I'm setting myself on fire. Roof, he said. I snorted. Ambitious. He left long enough to speak with the clinic's night nurse, an ex-field medic, with the posture of a retired saint, and came back with a motion that meant up. I leveraged myself off the cot with grace that would not impress a cat, and he pretended not to notice. He didn't offer an arm. He stayed close enough to be one. The stairwell to the roof was lined with old posters, the kind that once promised live music and cheap drinks, and now promised dust. The door at the top stuck halfway. Seb put a shoulder into it, and it remembered its purpose. Morning had just begun the delicate work of inventing itself. The city lay below in manageable pieces, streets like ruled lines, windows catching the first thin gold of the day. The wind was honest and cool, moving through the rooftop garden someone had coaxed into existence with broken planters and stubborn herbs. Coffee steam curled into the air and made the morning smell like decisions. We crossed to the low wall at the edge and stood there, shoulder to shoulder without ceremony. He set my coffee on the parapet and kept his in his hands. From here, the tower we'd left burning was a gap in the skyline, a negative shape still smudged by scaffolding and caution tape. Farther off, the river gave the light back to itself and made it generous. I always forget, I said, that the city looks almost gentle from up here. It isn't, he said. I know. I breathed in, slow. My side complained, but not as loudly as last week. But it tries for a minute every morning. I respect the effort. We didn't talk for a while. We didn't need to. The wind did what wind does. Moved things around without asking permission. A pigeon landed on the opposite ledge, judged us, and decided we weren't interesting enough to fear. You could have left, I said eventually, not looking at him. That night, before the tower. You could have handed the drive to someone else and gone home and let your handler keep your future in a file. I tried that once, he said. How'd it go? He sipped his coffee. You're here. I huffed out something that wanted to be a laugh and settled for being a breath. What about you? He added. You could have run. When I opened the cell, I did, I said. Toward the archive. He made a small sound that could have been approval. Or just wind. The sun reached across the rooftops like it was relearning the city by touch. Light climbed our boots, our knees, the scuffed edge of the parapet, the folder waiting between us. A siren far below tried on a new day and found it fit the same as yesterday. Somewhere, a bakery opened and sided with humanity by releasing the smell of cinnamon into the street. Next move? I asked. We leak in stages, he said. We testify once, maybe twice. We don't let them make us the story. Unlikely, I said. Are annoyingly cinematic. Then, we aim the camera at the right culprits. I nodded, and some small, tight thing in my chest loosened just enough to let me breathe without negotiation. I let my shoulder rest against his. Not the full weight, just the proof of life touch that says I know where you are. He didn't shift away. He didn't shift closer. He just stood there and shared the same square foot of morning. I thought of Howlfall. I thought of the lab's bright geometry, the way flames had redrawn corridors into truth. I thought of the word asset and the way we'd stolen it. Wind curled the edge of the folder and fluttered a page, the paper making a hush-hush sound like a secret deciding to go honest.